All right, we're about ready to get started. As we get started, I'd like to offer people an opportunity to use the Q&A section to post any questions that you might have during the talk, and at the completion of the presentation, I will be the curator of the questions, and of course, you feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, your affiliation. So I'm going to go ahead and begin. My name is Wallace Dixon, and I am the founding director of the East Tennessee State University Ballad Health Strong Brain Institute, which is made possible by a wonderful gift from Ballad Health System in East Tennessee and Western Virginia. Today, we're happy to have with us Deb Berke, is a graduate of the Family Science Program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the University of Delaware. Prior to joining Wilmington University as the Director of Psychology Programs and the Center for Prevention Science, she taught Family Studies and Women's Studies at Messiah College. She also directed the Gender Studies Project at Messiah College. Dr. Berke has been a consultant for the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency and the state of Delaware, where she has led training in trauma-informed approaches for 2 Delaware departments. Over the past 5 years, she has initiated trauma-informed workforce development initiatives for both the current and future workforce and trained over 4,500 individuals to date. She was the first vice president of the newly created Board of Directors for Trauma Matters Delaware, a grassroots nonprofit initiative, and an inaugural recipient of the Delaware First Lady's Compassionate Champion Awards, honoring her trauma-informed work. Dr. Berke is also a certified family life educator. And today she's going to talk to us about, are you a trauma-informed leader? I'll turn it over to Deb.
Wonderful. Thank you, Wally, for that nice introduction. Just going to pull up my slides. I'm seeing the chat fill with people's descriptions of who they are, where they're from. And I also asked you to drop in chat if you think you're a trauma-informed leader. But welcome. I'm excited to share with you today about leaders and the concept of trauma-informed and how those two intersect. I came into this work probably 6 or 7 years ago, having never ever heard of the concept of trauma-informed care before. And one of my adjunct faculty, who's in the audience actually, brought this to me and said, hey, there's this movement happening out in the social services world, and I think you should think about it, maybe incorporating some content for students into curriculum. And as soon as I learned about it, I was in hook, line, and sinker. And I drank the Kool-Aid and I've been in ever since. So I truly believe in a trauma-informed approach, and I believe it has application to a lot of settings, and definitely in terms of leadership. So I'm going to share with you today some of the headlines that have been in the news recently. Well, actually, this is from 2020 and from 2021. And you can see they reflect the concepts of trauma and toxic stress and what's been happening with individuals. And definitely this is post-pandemic. But if you think about these, if you look at the titles or look at the words too, you may have said, well, this was even happening pre-pandemic. And it's happening now, whatever phase we might consider ourselves in, whether we say post-pandemic or not. But the fact that people might be mentally exhausted, they may be physically exhausted, they may be having to make choices, and how that impacts them and their lives. We know recently there have been a lot of times of trauma and toxic stress. We may have experienced them on an individual level. Things like death, divorce, even getting married, even having a child can be stressful. And then things that happen on a larger scale at a community level, at a society level. And it could be things like the pandemic, it could be racial injustice and social unrest, it could be the political unrest. There have been lots of things that have been happening. And many of us have been experiencing, especially things happening on the community level. And so we've got that kind of common experience. So some of the questions I want to explore today are, what is trauma-informed leadership? what does it mean to lead in times of trauma? How are these similar and how are they different? And then how do we know if we're a trauma-informed leader? So I'm going to start with a little bit of background on trauma and toxic stress. And I encourage you at any point in time to, again, drop questions in the Q&A that we will have time to answer at the end. I will have time to answer at the end, but also things, resources if you've got them in the chat or the Q&A as well. So trauma is not the event itself. It is a response to stressful experiences and or conditions. It's not the event itself, but it's how we respond. And the U.S. Department of Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration talks about the 3 E's in trauma, which is the event, which is how we experience it, and then which is the impact or the effects of it. And so an example could be, what if there is a fire at a school and you are a child who's in a classroom very, very close to the fire? For example, you may even see the flames, you may even smell the smoke. Your experience of that event is going to be different, very different from a child who's in a whole different part of the building and doesn't have the sights, the sounds, the smells, may only be evacuated, may only see the firefighters coming. Their experience is also going to be very different from, say, the administrator in that school who's trying to make sure all the children and all the staff get out okay. And then also a very different experience for that firefighter who's coming to deal with the fire. So we have that same event, that fire at the school, but how individuals experience it can be very different depending upon their proximity to the event, previous experiences that they may have had in their lives that may impact how they react to an event and so on. And we might see effects that happen like children having nightmares, having physical reactions to perhaps going to school again the next day if it was if they were scared and they feel uncomfortable going back. Whereas administrators may also feel a little bit, cautious about going back, but also firefighters, it's their job. And so that's what they do. So the impact on the firefighter returning to school is very different perhaps than a child who was very close to that fire and or an administrator who was trying to get people out of the flames or out of the building, so to speak. So again, it's that event, but it's how we experience it and it's how the impact it has on us. The pandemic is also another great example where we've all experienced the pandemic. It's been a global experience, but my experience of the event may be very different from yours based on my health history, based on my resources, like if I have sufficient resources to pay for services, that I don't have to go out shopping for groceries, for example, in those early days of the pandemic. If I have health insurance and I've got the ability to take care of any illnesses I might have, my experience is going to be very, very different from someone who doesn't have those same kinds of resources. I was also blessed. I work at Wilmington University. We have been remote off and on, but for the most part remote for these last 2 years. And I am not a first responder or somebody who was deemed necessary. And so I did not have to go and work in close proximity to other individuals, again, impacting how I experienced the event and the effects that it could have on me. A recent study, well, actually, let's see, a study that began in the mid to late 1990s, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or also commonly known as ACEs, is a study that has collected data on adversity, trauma, or toxic stress. They actually began with 17,000 data on approximately 17,000 individuals, and looking at the impact of experiences that they had as a child on their health as an adult, on their behavior and their health and as an adult. And in the diagram here, you can see adverse childhood experiences is the third layer up. And moving up the pyramid, research has indicated that people who have experiences in their childhood that might be adverse or maybe trauma or toxic stress have disrupted neurodevelopment, might have social, emotional, or cognitive impairments, might adopt a health risk behaviors, and so on. The recent research has built upon this model to show that the social conditions in which we live, our context, as well as where we are historically, can also make a difference. Those two bottom bars here in this diagram. So we're looking at individuals within the context in which they live and the historical impact or trauma that they may have experienced over time, and how that might impact their adult social, emotional, cognitive, physical health. And then the most recent research has shown that there's actually a fourth element that we've now added. The across the top, you see what looks like a stormy cloud, lightning. That is the adverse environmental experiences or adverse environmental component. And that brings in the pandemic. It also brings in things like floods and tornadoes and hurricanes and all those other experiences we may or may not have, we don't have control over necessarily, but they do impact us. And so now research on trauma and on adversity is looking at us individuals within the context in which we live in historical time. And so the research has actually become much more robust now and much more exciting in terms of what it's going to bring to the table. But if we have trauma and toxic stress, we know it can impact us. It can impact us as a person. It can impact our families. It can impact our communities. If we work in organizations, it can impact us in an organization. It can impact our company, and it can impact us in a holistic way too. The graphic on the right-hand side shows you kind of the holistic, our holistic being, emotional, social, spiritual, environmental, intellectual, and physical. And so knowing that trauma and toxic stress have this capacity to impact us, it's important for us to take into account, what does that mean and how does that play out? So currently there are, one model shows 5 different trauma responses, or 5 different ways that we might respond to trauma now. You've probably heard of the fight, flight, or freeze. The fight where people get this rush of adrenaline. Oftentimes they can do things physically that they may not be able to do in normal times. So you've heard of people lifting cars off of people because they've had that rush of adrenaline. Flight refers to kind of withdrawing. And the example you'll see, it also includes overeating, distracting, staying busy. Freeze in the lower left-hand side talks about how we might shut down. We disassociate, we get scared, we can't move. All of these are good, can be good, depending upon what's happening to you in the here and now. But over time, they can become unhealthy behaviors. 2 newer ones include flop and fawn. Fawn, you'll see, talks about codependent pleasers, people who acquiesce, people who silence and repress themselves. One of my cats does fawn really well when he's being bad to his older brother, and his older brother's gonna show him what he's doing. He will tend to fawn and then turn into this pleaser, and it dissipates the tension between the two of them oftentimes. And then there's flopping, where people faint, where they go limp, where they lose physical control. So we may see one or more of these responses to trauma at any one point in time. And again, some of, like I said, they can serve very useful purposes in the here and now. If there's a bear in the woods, the Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris video where she talks about the bear in the woods, fight, flight, or freeze may be very healthy in that moment. But when we continually do some of these same responses over time in other settings, they may not be the healthiest responses. And so just being aware that they're not necessarily always negative or always positive, but they can play both. As a trauma-informed leader, what we want to do is we want to do these 4 R's. We want to first realize that trauma does exist. And we want to realize that it can impact individuals, it can impact families, it can impact communities. Then we want to recognize actually what those signs and symptoms look like. And so those 5 responses are things that we might see There are other signs and symptoms of trauma too that we might see, inability to concentrate, inability to have short or long-term memories of things, those kinds of things. But just recognizing what might signs and symptoms of trauma look like in individuals and families and communities. And then how do we respond? Do we practice this trauma-informed approach with the ultimate goal then of what? Resisting traumatization, re-traumatization, and also building resilience. That would be, I guess, maybe the fifth R, is building resilience. We want to enhance individuals, families, communities, organizations, skills, and knowledge so that they've got capacity, so that they may help buffer them from the impact of trauma and toxic stress. Because just simply by being alive, we will experience trauma and toxic stress, but the goal is to enhance our resilience so that it doesn't have always such an intense impact on us, let's say. The trauma-informed leader also utilizes these 6 principles as identified again by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And this includes safety, trustworthiness, empowerment, collaboration, peer support, and then the concepts of history, gender, and culture. And what I'm going to do in the next, I don't know, 20 or so minutes is do kind of a 30,000 overview of each one of these and what that might look like. So the first principle is safety. And this principle includes both physical safety and psychological safety. So in an organization, in a family, in a community, do people feel physically safe? Do they feel psychologically safe? An example might be, do you check in with people, whether it's your family, whether it's your friends, whether it's your coworkers, on a regular basis? Do you have an environment that has adequate lighting, it has adequate signage, it has, is it a place which has beautiful colors and nice graphics and murals where it also impacts our psychological well-being? And a good example of this is, right when COVID first hit, in those first 2 weeks especially, we didn't know how it was transmitted, how to prevent it. We were really struggling with what do we need to put into place immediately to be physically safe, but also then help us feel psychologically safe because we knew what to do to be physically safe. And people who were working in occupations where they were not sent home for 2 weeks, they had to be at work, could oftentimes struggling with maintaining physical and psychological safety. The second principle looks at trustworthiness and transparency. So are our operations, are our decisions, is our being conducted with transparency? So we have the goal of building and maintaining trust among our clients, our family members, or others involved in the organization. And this includes things like, are we clear with others about our roles and what we can and cannot do? Are we transparent about what's going to happen? Are we transparent about decisions that are made, as transparent as we can be with decisions that are made, so people can then make their decisions having the most information possible? How do we build and maintain trust among? Do we follow through? If we say we're going to do something, do we follow through with that activity? And do we let people know? So say a doctor or a police officer, do they let individuals know what they will be doing? And so that they explain the process. For example, a police officer explaining to somebody he's going to arrest that he's going to be touching their wrist and putting handcuffs on prior to doing it, so that along that time you're as transparent as possible. The third one is empowerment, voice, and choice. And this is where we recognize the fact that people, individuals, actually families, communities, organizations, have strengths and have experiences that which they've learned from, they've grown from, so that we can recognize these strengths, we can celebrate these strengths, and we can utilize these strengths moving forward. I first learned about trauma-informed approaches when I was at a conference for family violence, domestic violence, or intimate partner violence. And the presenter was explaining that in an intimate partner situation where violence was occurring, oftentimes the individual who was experiencing the violence may engage in certain behaviors, but in that setting, they were very protective behaviors. They were good behaviors. They were healthy behaviors because they were behaviors in trying to keep themselves, and if they had children or pets, alive. But translate those to other settings, and they may not necessarily be healthiest, but they had the capacity to make good choices and intuitively know strategies. And so in celebrating and recognizing that capacity, and then allowing them voice and choice and developing new skills is really critical. And believing in resilience as well. And the fact that resilience is not something we are born with, but it's something we develop, and it's something we can grow and nurture. And, we can develop new skills and create new networks and bring in new resources and enhance that. Voice and choice too, also, again, giving people voice and giving people choice so that would they prefer to do X or Y. In terms of parenting, I've often heard parents talk about, one way to avoid conflict with your children getting dressed in the morning is to lay out several outfits that you might think are appropriate, and then giving them choice. And oftentimes by doing that, it gives them some control and voice, but you've also then managed some of the conflict that may have originally occurred as you were trying to make choices. Principle 4, which is collaboration and mutuality. That's where the partnering and leveling of power differences happens. It's where everyone knows healing happens in relationships, those connections that we make with others. Oprah Winfrey, Bruce Perry talk a lot about connections. They talk about regulate, relate, and then reason. And it's in that relate, those connections, that lots of things can happen. It's how we share power and decision making. It's recognizing everyone has a role to play. And so one of my favorite examples is in a school setting. Well, from the time a child leaves a place where they eat, sleep, to the time that they return, anybody who interacts with that child, whether it's a crossing guard, whether it's a bus driver, whether it's a custodian, whether it's people in the lunchroom, whether it's their teachers, anybody has a role to play in that child's life. Everybody is important, and everybody is on that same team to make sure that child is successful. So recognizing that and giving everybody, recognizing that people have important roles to play regardless of where you are in the system, and no one is more important than another. The other is also bringing in, allowing individuals to have a choice in decision making. So, for example, I work in an educational setting, and one way to give students choice is to say, okay, here are my learning goals for today. Here's what I would like to happen. Here are 3 different ways we could do that. Which would you like to do? All 3 can accomplish those same learning goals, but I give them choice. I allow them to choose which one they prefer. And so that gives them some power, that gives them some control, that says we all have a role to play, and they get to be part of the decision maker. Peer support. Now this model, these 6 principles of SAMHSA are based on drug and alcohol field, the drug and alcohol field, and peer support is a very common phrase in that field. But I think this concept is applicable to any field. So peer support literally is, people being on the same team together, people supporting one another, people engaging one another, people encouraging one another. So if you are working in a group, if you've got a family, if you are part of an organization, if you're part of a community, does everybody support one another? Is everybody working together to build that trust, enhance the collaboration, maximizing the empowerment? Are you working and encouraging one another? And it also includes, are you holding one another accountable for their physical health and well-being? So it could be kind of gently, lovingly calling out somebody who you see may need a little time out and encouraging them to do so that they can come back refreshed and rejuvenated and ready to re-engage. And then last but not least is the cultural, historical, and gender issues. So this is where we actively address cultural stereotypes and biases, where we offer gender responsive services, where we leverage the healing value of traditional cultural connections, and we recognize and address historical trauma. And I know there's been a lot happening, especially with historical trauma recently, with what's happening in Ukraine, with what's happening here in the US, and acknowledging that and recognizing that and thinking about how can we address that, and how can we redress that, how can we make reparations, how can we make things better. The other piece about the healing value of the traditional cultural connections is having that cultural humility to learn, to ask questions, to say what has worked for you and people of in your community or with your racial and ethnic heritage, what has worked for you in the past, and how can we leverage that to enhance your health and well-being moving forward. A lot of companies, organizations have done work in this area, especially around diversity, equity, inclusion, and being. Or JEDI, you may have heard the JEDI too, including justice. And so making sure that we are actively doing this on a holistic kind of way. So those are the 6 principles. Becoming a trauma-informed leader, I would be willing to bet that pretty much everybody on in this webinar is already practicing one or more of those 6 principles. You've already incorporated, you've already been using one or more of those 6 principles. You may just not have known you were doing trauma-informed leadership. So as you were thinking about those, thinking about which ones you are already actively doing and you just want to enhance those. Thinking about the ones that you may not have known about or thought about and that you may need to, maybe those are your growth areas. So becoming trauma aware really is kind of that, taking that baseline. Where are you baseline? What do you know? What's your background? And having, doing education and becoming aware of a trauma-informed approach. And part of that you're doing right now. You're attending this webinar on Am I a Trauma-Informed Leader? So you're working on becoming trauma aware. Then you would move up through trauma sensitive, trauma responsive, and trauma informed, which include thinking about, okay, if I know safety, physical and psychological safety is important, and I gain an understanding of what those mean and what that looks like in a work site, or for me as a leader, for me to do, what does that mean now in terms of practice? So you gain the knowledge in trauma aware. Trauma sensitive, you think about how that knowledge applies to your site or your life or your your family or your community, and figure out what might need to be implemented. Trauma responsive, we're actually putting that into action, you're applying it all. And then trauma responsive is where it just happens naturally. Everything is already built in and you just kind of go on autopilot and it does it. The continuum implies that you never trauma, they're not discrete, independent phases or stages, that they overlap, that trauma aware exists along the entire process, that even once you have gained baseline knowledge, and there's always new research that comes out, new things to learn, right? And so I'm trauma aware. I'm always consistently in that stage, learning and trying to grow and develop. Then I think about, the new knowledge, I try and figure out where does it fit? How do I implement it? Then I start implementing it, and so on. So I would say it looks a lot like this diagram implies kind of a linear process. I would suggest perhaps it looks more like the continuous process improvement model. It's a circular process where you're always learning and improving and growing and developing. So am I a trauma-informed leader? I would say yes, but or I'm in the process of becoming a trauma-informed leader because I'm continually working to enhance my knowledge, my skills, my attitudes, my values, my beliefs. And at any one point in time, when I have the choice of making a decision, do I choose trauma-informed or not? And that happens every single time we get presented with a situation. We get the option of choosing trauma-informed or non-trauma informed. The non-trauma informed may be an appropriate response, but it may not necessarily just be trauma informed per se. So we always get that continual option of making the choice between being a non-trauma informed response or a trauma informed response. The diagram talks about implementing change takes time. This was actually developed for becoming a trauma-informed hospital or healthcare setting, but it's true for any setting. It's definitely a multi-year process. And again, I would suggest perhaps it's a continual process. And the metrics of assessing whether or not we're a trauma-informed leader, I've been searching. There are metrics that assess whether organizations are trauma-informed, but I'm still working to identify if there's an actual metric to determine what trauma-informed leadership actually looks like. So, if anybody on the webinar has examples, I know we can assess trauma-informed individuals, but what does that look like in leadership? Or is that a gap in the literature that needs to be developed? And at this point, in my opinion right now, it's a gap that exists and something that we need to develop. Now we know trauma impacts leaders, leaders impact trauma. Leaders can lead through trauma. Leaders have led through the pandemic, but whether the leaders have led through the pandemic in a trauma-informed way or not, just because you lead through a trauma doesn't mean you lead in a trauma-informed way. And I'll give an example from my own institution. We shut down at the start of the pandemic. We were told for 2 weeks, come back. We would get communications periodically. But at one point, we got a communication that said, your badges have been deactivated and you may not get on campus. And as an employee, I mean, that may have been an entirely appropriate response, but as a trauma-informed response, as an employee, I felt like I'd been fired. I felt like I was let go. I was no longer part of the organization, which wasn't, I'm sure, the message they wanted to communicate, but how they communicated the message, I took the message as I'd been fired. I was no longer part of the organization. And so that would be where they communicated a decision in a non-trauma informed way, as opposed to could have done it in a trauma informed way. So yes, it's possible to lead through trauma, but you may not always do it in a trauma informed way. On the flip side, even though there's a lot of trauma and toxic stress that does exist in our lives and in our world, but there are times that we're leading that it's not trauma, we're not experiencing trauma or toxic stress necessarily, but I think I will argue that a trauma-informed approach is appropriate whether or not you experience trauma or toxic stress. And by doing it, by incorporating those principles of empowerment, of collaboration, of trust, of transparency, of safety, you build a team, you build a community, you build a system that's a healthier system holistically. So I would argue that using a trauma-informed approach is important, whether or not you're experiencing trauma. Now, when we do experience trauma, it definitely impacts us as leaders, right? Because we're human. It obviously has to impact us. One of the things that we as leaders bring to the table is firsthand trauma, our own personal trauma histories. So what's our background? What kind of family environments did we come from? What kind of experiences might we have had as adults? And how does that impact our interactions with others? There's also secondary trauma, which is when we get stress related to helping others with trauma. And an example is one of my current doctoral students is looking at the impact of violence in social media, specifically YouTube, on the viewers. And she was interviewing them, talking with them, and then looking at the data, analyzing the data. In the process, she experienced trauma and toxic stress because of hearing about their experiences. And she had to step away for a little bit and do some self-care so that she could come back. But she experienced secondary trauma, the trauma of helping others who experience trauma. Compassion fatigue, feeling when there's nothing you can do to help, whether you're irritable, angry, sad, numb, don't care. I don't care what you're feeling. This is what's going to happen. When I was doing training with our Department of Health and Social Services, one of our child support services individuals reported in their evaluation, an anonymous evaluation, but reported it that they were experiencing compassion fatigue and working with the parents who owed child support and were not caring, didn't care about why they couldn't pay, didn't care that they weren't paying, just wanted them to pay. That's what they had to do. And she realized that compassion fatigue was coming home with her and impacting her home environment. And she didn't want to be like that. She realized when she first started her job, she wanted to help people. She wanted to make a difference. And over time, she got irritable, angry, sad, numb. And that was significant for her. That was an aha moment. She said, oh my gosh, I need to do something different. This is not working for me. And then there's our personal triggers. What triggers us? What sets us off? What pushes our buttons? What makes us angry? I know for me personally, I hear my dad's voice in my head going, hard work, pays off. Everybody should work hard, do your best. And sometimes when I have students who have said, I just want to get it done. I just want to be good enough. And I'm like, I hear my dad's voice in my head going, hard work, do your best, hard work, do your best. And I recognize that, for some, I need to let that go and let them make choices that work for them and say, if that's what you would like, I will support you. Just let me know how I can support you. But knowing my trigger, knowing a trigger for me, helps impact then how I interact with others. So many of us don't spend time, I think, thinking about what triggers us and what pushes our buttons and what makes us angry. And it could be too, sometimes and it could happen more when we're tired, when we're hungry, when we need some sleep, when we've been working a lot. Our personal triggers, what pushes our buttons, could be magnified then, could be blown up big. And it doesn't take much. It's that straw that breaks the camel's back, right? So thinking again about that, what's the straw? What's your straw? And how might that impact you? And knowing that ahead of time, going into settings, going into situations, what might you need to do then to have more meaningful, healthier interactions and impact on individuals? Self-care is so important. You've heard the analogy that when you're on an airplane, you need to put on your oxygen mask first, unless you don't care about the children or the people you're traveling with, but put on your oxygen mask first before you take care of others, because if you don't take care of yourself, you are no good to anybody else. And I like the umbrella analogy actually too, because in many ways, the umbrella is a resource that we have. It buffers us from that rain and the wind, sometimes better than others. But it's a good way to take care of ourselves, to put things in place that buffer us from that trauma and toxic stress out there. So our intentional actions, things that we can take intentionally to care for ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally, or spiritually. I just did a retreat this last weekend, a 3-hour yoga retreat that had wine, and it was something that enhanced my physical, my mental, my emotional, and my spiritual health by engaging in physical activity like yoga, by being very introspective, and by being in the company of others and enjoying connecting with others. Any behaviors that balance the effects of emotional and physical stressors can be good. I like to exercise as well. So, and I realized I tend to do activities like Zumba and pound or step classes that you have to be present in that class to participate. You can't be thinking about anything else. And if you do, you get off beat, off step. And so I like to choose activities that really separate me and buffer me from the rest of the world and get me there present in that moment, but that are also physically taxing or challenging, and get my endorphins going and my adrenaline going, and that get all the physical benefits of that. So I realize I intentionally choose activities that will balance physical and emotional stressors. And then the concept is self-soothing. Again, how can we calm our own physical and emotional stress? One thing I do is I have snow globes kind of scattered throughout my house, because when you shake up the snow globe and then you watch the snow settle, and it calms you, it centers you, it can get you emotionally calmed down. It's a way to calm or self-soothe. Coloring can be good. Physical things like knitting. A lot of people do handcrafts, I know, to do this self-soothing. Anything you can do, though, to self-soothe or calm yourself is very useful. Mindfulness activities are great. So thinking about what might work for you. Because really, almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you, says Anne Lamott. One of my favorite quotes, one of my favorite authors. And, sometimes we just need to unplug ourselves even for a few minutes, and we'll work again. So let me do a little promo, and then I'll open it up for questions. So at Wilmington University, I oversee the Center for Prevention Science. I do training, as you heard, for different agencies and organizations, most recently with the healthcare system in our state of Delaware. We do have curricular options for our students at both the undergraduate and graduate levels in trauma and resilience. And then we also have embedded content about trauma-informed care approaches across our undergraduate psychology degree. My contact info is here, my email address and my phone number, and you are welcome to reach out to me. I can share a copy of the slides with you, and you can have that after the presentation. But I would love to hear from you and hear about your experiences and hear what you're doing. And for that, I think now we will open it up to questions and conversation.
Thanks, Deb. That was excellent. Well, the first question was, can you share the slides? And so you answered that one. I have a question here from Dr. Palaha. She says, I'd love to know if the speaker is familiar with models of servant leadership, and if such models are de facto trauma informed, and what overlaps or gaps are there between the two?
So I will say, I am not an expert on servant leadership. I have sort of a little rudimentary understanding of it, but I do believe that a lot of models out there do have trauma-informed practices and principles in them. I do think servant leadership probably does as well, because I think the principles, especially of collaboration, mutuality, of empowerment, voice, and choice, I think are embedded in servant leadership. And so it's possible that the concepts already are out there, but there may be others that, from those 6 principles of SAMHSA, for example, that you may see that could enhance what's already done with the servant leadership model.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. This is my own question. And I know you've been doing this work on your campus longer than we have here at East Tennessee State University. But one of the questions I have is, how do you get buy-in in promoting trauma-informed leadership? It seems that for some folks, having to do stuff related to the word trauma is off-putting.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons I think why I talk about trauma and toxic stress, because sometimes people have issues with the word trauma and they will say they don't experience trauma or they haven't experienced trauma, but we've all experienced toxic stress, especially with the pandemic and so on. And so language can make a difference. My institution adopted this as one of their strategic priorities in 2019. And it came about because of individuals in our administration attending a presentation on trauma-informed approaches and saying, well, this sounds like this could make a difference in student success. It sounds like it could make a difference in retention. It sounds like it could make a difference in employee health and well-being. And if it sounds like a no-brainer, why wouldn't we do it then? Because those are all the kinds of things that we want to promote at our institution. And so showing the ROI, I know there's a need for research out there really to document the ROI, and it's starting to bubble up. But I think we can definitely make even inferences that if we use trauma-informed approaches with students, for example, we're much more likely to have fewer student, not altercations, but student complaints. For example, one thing I do is late work. I went to having a very rigid, strict policy about late work to saying, you know what, I'll give you 7 days, I'll give you 10 days. You can choose how you use those days. If you turn in one assignment 10 days late, no penalties, all your other assignments on time, whatever. I trust you as an adult to make choices and to do what's in the best interest of your work and your family and your life. And I don't need to micromanage you. And so I will allow you the ability to make that choice. And it's definitely cut down on the number of, I'm going to turn this in late. Is that okay? I've got to track, and do the penalties. So it's a more positive, strength-based approach than a deficit kind of approach.
Thank you. I have another question here, and just ask people if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the Q&A. There's one that says, is there a trauma-informed evaluation, assessment, or certification that an organization or company can go through to become certified or verified?
So there are a number of trainings out there. I don't know, there's not one big central overarching organization that oversees trainings and determines, if this one is adequate, if this one, covers all the bases. One of the things that the organization I'm working with now, Trauma Matters Delaware, it's a backbone organization, is trying to kind of create some standards for what should an organization now do to be call themselves trauma informed. And so it's kind of curating the literature out there, figuring out what people are doing and what it says, and then what are the must-dos and must-haves, and then how can we create those standards. But currently, there's no overarching organization that has standards like that. So a lot of people do use the SAMHSA principles, 6 principles, do use a lot of work from SAMHSA, as well as the CDC, the ACEs study, and the newest study, which came out of Kelly Graves and her group, I think it's the Kellen Foundation in North Carolina. So there are some kind of things bubbling up. My team and I have been working on a developmental framework for individuals and organizations, calling themselves trauma-informed, or what it means to be a trauma-informed individual and organization, based on the Missouri model, which is an organizational model, and it's seems to be fairly widely used in social services. So trying to get some standards out there, develop some standards, but still in process.
And I'll go ahead and also make a shameless self-promoting plug. The Strong Brain Institute right now is working with the Tennessee Department of Health. We're contracted to do exactly that, to identify standards of trauma-informed workplace. Right now, we're actually just beginning. That contract started on February 1st. And theoretically, by July the 31st, we've identified stakeholders to work with us, including prominent people throughout state of Tennessee, work with us to identify possible grades of being trauma-informed in the workplace, sector-specific trauma-informed structures. So we are working that in the state of Tennessee, and we'll know more in a few months, about 5 months. I do see that Virginia Foley has her hand raised, and so I'm going to allow her to talk. So I'm going to press the button. And there she is, Virginia.
Virginia, do you have a question or comment?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just glad that you, Dr. Dixon, had mentioned the Strong Brain Institute and the work that's happening here at ETSU.
Yeah,
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It's been fun. It's fun and exciting and challenging. Any more questions? Okay, I see another hand raised. Oh no, that went down. Okay. I don't see any more questions. So Deb and I do have connections. So if anybody else has questions for Deb, I'm happy to relay them for you. Other than that, thank you so much, Deb. It was a great talk, and I'm looking forward to continue working with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate that. And thank you for those of you who came today. I appreciate your interaction and your comments and your questions. And again, you will get a copy of the PowerPoint slides, so feel free to reach out to me that way as well. And I see somebody asked in the chat, how do they reach you, Wally? So I don't know if you want to drop your email in the chat as well.
There you go.
And Wally did not mention, but he and I and others are part of this national group, and we are talking and sharing resources like this. And so this way we can have a more, we're not working siloed in pockets, but we can, and duplicating efforts. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and reference that. We have created a listserv, or I guess an organization that has a listserv, which stands, well, the acronym for which is CURE, C-U-R-E, Colleges and Universities for Resilience. And to belong to that group, really, the only interest you have to have is an interest in trauma-informing higher educational institutions. Other than that, it's pretty wide open, and we meet once every other month in the odd months out of the year on a Wednesday at 2:00 p.m. And you're welcome to join us. If you are interested, just shoot me an email. But other than that, thank you all for being here, and have a great Monday.